right, let me hear you, Daybreak. Come on. Man, wasn't that a great song? Thank you, band. Very good. All right. Well, we're ending the series today, so we have one more experiment. And just going to tell you, this is fulfilling a lifelong dream of mine to play with this substance, because I've never done this before, but I've wanted to. Dry ice. Dry ice is amazing. How many of you ever played around with dry ice before? Okay. Oh, a lot of you. Wow. Okay. Feel left out. Okay. Got my assistant here, Melly. And she just joined staff here at Daybreak, but she's a part of Daybreak. Let's give it up for Melly. Ready to go? Now, I also have a couple other helpers that I want to bring up. Two young men. Come on up, gentlemen. These are a couple of our explorers here at Daybreak. All right. Let's welcome these guys. How we doing? All right. So I want you to see if you can find yourself in this picture, guys. So this Wednesday, we had 40 at our Explorers program who earned their badge for this last 6 weeks. Oh, come on, you guys. Really? All right. That's, man, don't give me no lame claps for our kids here, all right? You guys up there in that picture? You up there? Okay. Now, let me ask you, do you guys know each other? Okay. Are you related? Look here. Do they look related? Okay. Now, not only are they identical twins, they have sisters. Are they here? Girls, stand up real quick. They have two sisters that are identical twins. Do you know we had a family at Daybreak that's got two sets of identical twins? You guys are 2 years apart. Is that about 2 years? So that's like instant family. That's pretty cool. So you guys should like have your own TV show here. It's pretty cool. So you guys ready to help today? Okay. We got to get on some goodies here. We're going to get your coats on. We should probably wear goggles today. Does anybody know the temperature of dry ice without having to look it up? What do you think? 0.01? Close. Negative 109. So just think 3 months from now. That's what you're going to be experiencing. Okay, so we got some dry ice here, and I've always wanted to do this. So we've got water. Dry ice is basically like crystallized carbon dioxide, so we're going to have some fun here. Now, it's obviously really cold, boys, so we're going to let you drop some in there. Are you ready for this? Okay, so reach in there. Grab a piece, throw it in the water, drop it. Yeah, probably not throw it. Okay. You want to do a couple more? We'll do a couple more here. Is it good to have more or less? Little ones? Okay. Can I do one? All right. I get to do one. Okay. Is that good? Okay, cool. Isn't that really cool? Now, that's not all. So what we've been talking about in this series is like what happens when things collide in nature, chemicals or substances, things like that. But on a bigger, deeper level is what happens, just realized I still had these on. What happens when our lives collide spiritually? And we've been having this discussion here for the last few weeks. So this is obviously a pretty cool thing. And Melly's going to take it to the next level here. This may take a second, but if we can get this to work, this will be super, super cool. So in the last few weeks, as we've talked about this, there's been so many people's lives that have been changed. And when we consider that when our lives collide, and much like this, there's a reaction, there's a response, but there is a change. Over this last series, just within the last few weeks, we've seen so many people's lives change. We've seen healing. We've seen people give their lives to Christ for the very first time. And it's been fun each week to try this little experiment. How are we doing here? Okay, we're getting there. This is well worth it, but this takes like a special art to be able to do this. Ooh, almost got it. Okay, I think we got it. Okay, there it is. Now watch what this does here. This is pretty sweet. Boys, you ready? Hopefully the building doesn't explode here when this thing grows and builds. That's really good. I wish I could do that. So when you put dry ice and you can kind of create this, whatever you just did, Melly, it starts to grow and there's like this chemical reaction happening inside. But when it gets to a certain level, something really, really cool happens. We're going to see if we can get it to go right here. Here, isn't that amazing? That's pretty cool. Something you want to do at home. All right, guys, good job. Can we thank our awesome assistants here today? Good job, gentlemen. Thank you, Melly. Very, very good. So what happens when our lives collide with Jesus? That's where we're going to go today. And over the last few weeks, we've gone on this journey. Now, last week, I just want to remind us of last week because life moves fast. And a week ago may seem like a month ago, but for those of us that were here last week, God really challenged us, and hundreds of us committed with this idea of what's it like to be on the lookout to see people that need to find Jesus. And we talked about this app that we have on our phone that's a native app. And it helps you to locate people or things or items. And what is it for us? Who is it in our lives that God has placed there that we need to be thinking about and actively searching for to have intentional conversations about faith and bringing them to Jesus, just like we talked about last week. And there are some specific steps that we took of asking God to give us a name, to write those names down, and then to be committed, especially as we enter into this Christmas season, which just in a couple months, we've got the Christmas Village happening, and this place will be filled with thousands of people. And it's our job to be a part of being a person that can help bring people to interact with Jesus. And so it was a really powerful time last week. And throughout this series, we've talked about some different people. And as we wrap that up today, I'm excited to see what God's going to speak to us. Now, it's been mentioned, but our next series starts next week. And it's called Generate. And it's about how does God take things that he's given us, and when we properly put them in their place, he multiplies them. We live in a world of exponential multiplication because of the nature of God and his creation. We're gonna talk about all those things, but if you're newer to Daybreak, here's the drill. So tomorrow, it's time to jump in. If you haven't yet already, pick up one of these growth guides on your way out today if you're in the house. If you're also maybe with us on Daybreak Live, or you want to go online, if you go to growthguide.study, you can get a copy and a digital version there. But when you pick up one of these, we're going to start our daily Bible readings tomorrow. And that's kids, that's students, that's big kids. And we're going to talk about it next week. But over the last few weeks, we've talked about this man, Nicodemus, was how we started off this series called Collide. And how he was religious, but even though he had all the knowledge, he didn't have what was real in his heart. And when he collided with Jesus, how his life changed. And then the next week we talked about this woman who had this physical ailment that just was incapacitating for her entire life. And for 12 years she struggled through this, and she met Jesus, and her life collided with his, and his healing touch healed her. We talked about Peter, who went from failure to faith, and how we don't need to be held back by the failure in our past. We talked about the woman at the well that Jesus interacted with in John chapter 4 in the Bible, where she lived this past full of shame, and Jesus rescued her from that. And then last week we talked about this man who was paralyzed, who literally couldn't make his way to Jesus. And he had some friends that helped him do that. And Jesus brought salvation and healing to this man. And that brings us to today, which is a story that I remember hearing when I was a little kid growing up in church. And it's found in Luke chapter 19. And I just want to read it for you. I want you to put yourself there in the story. I want you to imagine yourself out on a hot Middle Eastern day when Jesus is coming into town and being in the crowd and watching what happens. And here's what it says. So Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through, and a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. And he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead. He climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once, and he welcomed him gladly. And all the people saw this, and they began to mutter, he is gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up And he said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. What a powerful story of interaction. And as we're introduced to this man, Zacchaeus, there's an observation. And I was thinking about how I would describe this man. There's things we know. This is the only time in the Bible that this man, Zacchaeus, is mentioned. But the first thing I would say to him is that he was unhappily wealthy. Now, do those two words go together? Does that work, to be unhappy and yet wealthy? Because that's what we see with Zacchaeus. He clearly realized that there was something missing. And in the brief moments that we have with him in the Bible, there's really 3 kind of things that stand out about Zacchaeus and who he was. So who was this guy named Zacchaeus? Well, we basically know 3 things about him. We know, first of all, that he was what's called today a short king. You know what that means? He was a little guy. In other words, he was the last person to know when it rained. Okay, does that make sense? And not only was he short, we also know that he was wealthy. We also know that he was a tax collector. Now, maybe you picked up an extra word in there, an adjective that even went further to describe Zacchaeus. Not only was he a tax collector, it says he was a chief tax collector. So he was kind of really high up in management, so to speak. Now, a tax collector, they were pretty notorious. So not only did they work to collect taxes, so it would be our version here in America, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Not only did he collect taxes, but he worked for a foreign government. So I want you to imagine if the IRS here in America was ran by a foreign entity, a foreign government that wasn't ran by the United States. That's who Zacchaeus was. He worked for this foreign government, the Roman Empire. And so he was considered not only a cheat, but a traitor. Now, tax collectors, the way they kind of made it is they kind of collected whatever they really decided they wanted to. They were given a certain amount that they had to collect for the Roman Empire. But whatever they got on top of that was kind of gravy. It was kind of theirs. So they were known to be pretty greedy people. And to work your way up to be the chief tax collector, where you're in charge of others, you really had to be good at your job. In other words, you had to be really good at being really bad. So that's who Zacchaeus was. And yet he found that there was something missing in his life. Here's a lot of times what we maybe don't like to admit or won't admit when we're in circles like this in church. But let me tell you that when you're living your life and you're doing whatever you want, you're living at whatever pleasure you would like to enjoy in your life, let me tell you that it's fun. That sin can be fun. Can we say that? Because living your life and doing whatever you want, there's a certain amount of enjoyment with it. In fact, the Bible says that sin is enjoyable. Now, it doesn't end there with what it says about sin, but in other words, you go off and you live the vida loca and you do whatever you want. And you say, whatever pleasure, whatever experience, whatever I want to do to make myself happy, I am just going to do it. Because if it feels good, I'm just going to do it. And that's where Zacchaeus was. He had everything. He was what we would call, in our terms today, he was the 1%. In terms of his economic standing and status. He had everything, but yet he had nothing. He was missing something. That's why he went to meet this man, Jesus. Who is this miracle man that I'm hearing about? And is all the hype for real? What happens if I meet this man, Jesus? Well, I find that fulfillment that I've been missing in my life. Now, you may look at Zacchaeus' story. You may go, well, I'm not really a cheat and I'm not really wealthy. And I don't know if I can really relate to this man. But I want to put a little bit in context where we are right now. Because as I'm standing here right now, and I know there are people all over the world that follow Daybreak and listen and are part of what we're doing here. But for those of us here, in the United States, I want to show you this map, and I want you to get some perspective on the amount of wealth that exists in America. So you see on this map here, you see United States highlighted there in red. And our wealth, last time it was calculated, is approximately $145.8 trillion. That's the wealth that exists in our country. And then you see the rest of the world, and minus a few countries there, specifically 6 ones. Germany, France, UK, China, Japan, and India. You remove those countries, every other country in the world is 146 trillion in combined wealth. So what you see in this little space, the United States, our wealth in our country is equal almost to the entire rest of the world. Now you may think, okay, yeah, that's our country, Geoff, but that's not me. That's us. Now, we live in one of the most affluent countries in the world, and in many ways, the most affluent. But let's hit home here. If your income in your family is $10,000, you are wealthier than 84% of the world. And if your income is $50,000 or more, you make more than 99% of the world in terms of wealth in comparison. So it's funny how we look at the world and we think, well, I'm not really wealthy. But if you've traveled and you've been around the world and you've seen different places, not just through a screen, but personally, and some of you here have done this, you know that where we live is not normal. That what we experience is not normal. The amenities and the luxuries that we have, that's not normal for the rest of the world. But because we're so immersed in it, sometimes we can't really understand it. And I've met so many people over my life that believe something that I used to believe. And here's what I used to believe. If I just had a little bit more, then I could really be generous. Geoff, if my income could go up 5 or 10 or 15%, if I could just get ahead a little bit, if I could just get a little bit more of my savings, if I could just get this, then I would be generous. And here's what I want to say to you is that money does not change your values. Often we think, well, if I can just get more, then I would do that. Money doesn't change your values. Money reveals them. And money accentuates the person that you already are. In other words, if you are a generous person, then if you get more, you're more generous. But if you're a greedy person and you get more, then you just tend to become more selfish and greedy. And I think there's this idea that a lot of us believe and a lot of the world believes is like, well, if I just had this, then I could do that. And here's what I would say. If you're not doing it already, then it won't change if you get more. Because money does not change your character. It just reveals who you are. And it accentuates it the more or the less that you get. I have an older brother, and we have this joke between us that he has this saying that I always think is really funny. He says, the 2 most true songs ever written are number 1, Amazing Grace, which if you know that song, it's an amazing song of faith. But the second one was a little more surprising to me. He said, the second most true song ever written was by the amazing artist Cyndi Lauper. Some of you know who that is. And it's a song called Money Changes Everything. Okay, and that's all we can play, or our copyright will get shut down. Nobody will be watching on Daybreak Live. It's funny that we joke about that song because it's really true is that when money enters in the equation, man, everything changes. Money changes everything in a lot of ways. And when we think about where we are now, we need to realize that we can be unhappily wealthy. We also see that Zacchaeus, not only was he unhappy in his circumstances, but that he was determined to see Jesus. That he overcame all the obstacles to get to Jesus. Now, we already talked about it. He was a short little guy. He couldn't see above the crowd. But although he didn't have a lot of physical stature, he had a lot of financial and societal stature in terms of just what he had. But he says he went ahead of the crowd. He knew Jesus was coming through. And maybe against his pride, in self-respect, he chose to climb up into this tree, maybe doing something that was very undignified in that moment. But he wanted to see Jesus, that his physical challenges of literally seeing Jesus, he was not going to let them stand in the way from him experiencing and seeing the miracle man. And we all have challenges. What I found is a lot of times that there are many days in my life when it feels like the world is just setting up challenge after challenge in my life, and it's hard to see Jesus some days. And there are some days, if you're really determined, that you can push those challenges, those obstacles out of the way. And like Zacchaeus, I don't know, maybe yours is a physical challenge of some kind. I know people that struggle just to make it here physically present at Daybreak, to gather together every week. And that might be a physical obstacle that you're continually having to struggle with. And that you may need to have, a determination to overcome something like that. Or it might be a relationship. It might be your past. There might be an obstacle. In fact, I bet there is one. And is that obstacle keeping you from seeing Jesus? Because it was in that moment when he was so determined to see Jesus that as Jesus was walking by, the plot twist thickens when Jesus stops and looks up in that tree. And not only does he call out to this man, but if you notice, he calls him out by name. He says, "Hey, Zacchaeus, I see you up there. I see you." He calls him by name. Jesus sees you, by the way. He sees you. He knows your life story. He's familiar with maybe the pain or the shame or the guilt. He's familiar with all of it. He knows your story. And in the midst of that, just like he did with Zacchaeus, he is calling you by name. That's the amazing thing about this God that we're talking about, is when Jesus says things like that God knows the very number of hairs on our head, that he knows you and he is calling to you personally. And so Zacchaeus hears this, and then Jesus again puts another twist in the story. He says, "Hey, Zacchaeus, come down, because I'm going to come over to your house." Now that's pretty bold. That's pretty audacious. In fact, I don't know when the last time this has happened to you, but have you ever had a friend call you and say, "Hey, I'm going to be over in your house in 5 minutes." And you got 5 minutes to get the fake house ready. You know what I'm saying? You're putting things away. You're throwing away couches. You're throwing away kids. You're doing whatever you can to just get things presentable, right? Shoving things in the closet, wiping the sinks down, whatever you do, right? But Jesus here was not invited, but he says, "I'm coming to your house." Now, this is symbolic in this society. When you would be invited or go over to a person's house, that was a sign of friendship. And that's why in the story, people are like muttering to themselves, like, "Look at Jesus. He's going over to this sinner's house. Like, why is he associating with this evil person?" And you may not think that you're worthy of having this close, intimate, personal relationship with God. But I want to tell you that not only is Jesus calling your name, but he also wants to come over to your house. And you don't have to get it ready. That's what I love about God. We don't have to get our life in order before we come to him. Zacchaeus had a lot of baggage. He was a cheat. He was a thief. But when he met Jesus, his values changed. All of a sudden, there was a difference. It was almost like in a moment, Zacchaeus says, "Wow, I see the world differently." It was an interaction with Jesus that all of a sudden changed his values. And he left forever changed. Because when we meet Jesus, we can't help but be changed. Now, in the story, Zacchaeus says, "Anybody that I've ever cheated, I'm going to pay them back." I want you to look at the process of restitution in the scriptures that maybe he would have been familiar with. So for example, if you were to rob someone deliberately and there was some kind of violence or destruction involved in that, then you were required by religious and cultural law to pay back restitution 4 times the amount, just like Zacchaeus did. But if you were to do that, if you were to rob someone and you were able to restore what you took, then you only had to pay back twice the amount. But if you volunteered and you said, I was wrong, and you voluntarily pay restitution, and you made a confession, then you had to give back what you took, the original value plus 20%, plus a fifth. And Zacchaeus goes way above and beyond what was legally required in saying, I'm going to pay back not just 1.2 times, I'm going to pay back 4 times the amount. So it was in that moment that Zacchaeus went from greedy to generous. And what's crazy in our world is people that have had an interaction with Jesus, but maybe things haven't changed. Here's a question. If you've met Jesus, if you've committed your life to him, if I were to ask you, are you a follower of Jesus, and you were to say yes, let me ask you, have your values changed as a result? And let me go a step further. Are your values changing? Not just, oh yeah, I changed a long time ago and I'm different. Are they changing now? Because what I found is when you follow Jesus, there's always another step to take. There's always another step on the path, on the journey of faith with him, where he wants to bring change in our lives. So it's not just, oh yeah, I changed a long time ago, but I am changing now. I'm seeing it. And particularly in this specific area of values and generosity, I really feel like that is the defining issue that really puts on display if our values have changed. And let me get specific here for a minute. So we live in a world where the values often that we have don't reflect what we see in Scripture. So for example, there's a growing movement in our society of young couples and families choosing not to have children. And maybe you're familiar with this, and maybe you think this way. And they say, well, it's just not something that we want. And if you bore deep into those issues, and a couple that has the ability to have children but choose not to, I'm going to tell you what it boils down to is selfishness. What it boils down to is we want to have a great house, we want to have 2 great cars, we want to have a great vacation, and the words used are, we can't afford to have kids. And I'm going to tell you, just a few months ago, I'm standing in Liberia, and I'm looking at the faces of these beautiful children, and I'm thinking about the fact that this, according to the world standards, is the 7th poorest country in the world, and yet half of their population is under age 18. And I see all these beautiful Liberian children running around. And I'm asking myself the question a few months ago when I was there. When I think about the United States and Liberia and what we value, here's the question I ask myself. Who is more rich? Is it us Americans that want this posh lifestyle, to where a trend with young couples and even young Christian couples is choosing sterilization for life rather than having children because they have a different set of values? And let me even go a step further while I'm there. God gave specific instructions to humanity when it all started. He said, I want you to do 2 things. I want you to take care of the earth, and I want you to populate it. There is a growing belief that the more people that we have, the worse things will be. And I'm going to tell you straight up, that is a satanic agenda and mindset. There is an agenda to depopulate the earth. That may sound crazy to you. I've tracked this for 20 years. That is a satanic agenda to devalue life to the point where we equate life with possessions and resources and money. It's wrong. That's not the values of God. And I hope that we as a church and as families don't buy into those ideas, because to me it's so ironic that we are the most affluent culture perhaps in the history of the world, and we have people saying we can't afford to have children. It's not about affordability, it's about values. And that may be a value that you might want to consider allowing God to have when it comes to the value of human life. It might challenge our values of our vocation. I should probably mention this more, but I felt like God brought it to mind that there came a point in my life as a young man where I felt God specifically asked me to sacrifice my vocation for Him, to what I felt was a detriment to my financial success and security that I wanted for my life, living in a very lower middle class home. I wanted to get out of that. And perhaps God might be speaking to you as a young person, maybe as a parent, maybe in the middle or even at the end or after the end of your career, and saying, would you give me your vocation? And would you give your life to a ministry calling that might come at great financial sacrifice? I want to tell you, we have people on our staff that have made great financial sacrifice in their career because they felt God calling them to surrender that. And there's great purpose and joy that they found. Maybe that might be something for you. Maybe it's just giving in general. When I look at the numbers, there's a statistic that says only 5% of churchgoers tithe on a regular basis. Tithing is giving 10% of what we've received in life. And only 5% of churchgoers do that. And I've asked the question thousands of times to myself, what if every person that said they were a follower of Jesus that was a part of a local church, what if they were to tithe 10%? What would be possible? And man, when it comes to our lives colliding with Jesus, I might be talking about this and you might be extremely uncomfortable. And you might be offended. And you might say, Geoff, you're getting too personal here. I want to tell you, I'm not after your money. I'm believing that when we understand the difference between being greedy and generous, it changes us. Listen to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, about as plain as it gets. No one can serve two masters. Either you hate the one and love the other, or you be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Jesus makes it so clear. Look at this list of things that money promises and God promises. You might notice a pattern here. Money will promise you enjoyment. Money will promise you deliverance from your problems. Money will promise you happiness. Money will promise you security. Money will promise you solutions. But you know what? God will promise you enjoyment. And God will promise you deliverance. And God will promise you happiness. And God will promise you security. And God will promise you solutions. And the question is, who are we going to trust to give us those things? If we choose to trust in money, it will be a dead-end road. It will lead us to being empty and unfulfilled. But if we choose to trust God, specifically in this area, you will find more fulfillment and more security and more happiness and more everything than you could possibly imagine. You find it in Him. Here's what I've learned. You cannot be both godly and greedy. You can't be both. If you're going to be a greedy person that never gives, that keeps everything for yourself, and your selfish reasons, and your security, and your whatever, You can't find godliness in that kind of value system, but you can through generosity. Generosity is an expression of godliness. As we've explored this particular story, we have to ask ourselves, have our values changed since we met Jesus in the area of generosity? And I'm praying for our church that God would continue, because it's a journey for every single one of us, no matter where you are, for God to show us the way and the joy of giving, what that does for the world and what that does to change us. It's amazing. Over the last few weeks, as we've considered these people's lives that have collided with Jesus, it's time for us to think about our own. I want you to stand with me here for a moment. And whether you're with us here in the house or on Daybreak Live, I want you to think about what story in this series. Maybe it was Nicodemus, who was religious and he knew all the answers, but he didn't have it in here in his heart. And a meeting with Jesus changed everything. It took him from being just a religious robot to a person that was real and genuine in their relationship with God. Maybe it was that bleeding woman who had this thing that was just incapacitating for her life, that she couldn't break through, and she needed the healing touch of Jesus. And maybe you relate with her. Maybe it was Peter who experienced this moment of incredible failure when he denied Jesus to his face, and he then gazed into the eyes of Jesus and he saw love. And that moment took him from failure to faith. Maybe it was the woman at the well that we talked about 2 weeks ago, that lived a life that brought a lot of shame, made a lot of bad choices, lived with a lot of regret, had a reputation. And when she met Jesus, that shame turned to freedom. Or maybe today, God wants to transform you from being completely self-focused to a person that expresses the love of God through generosity. I hope and pray that in this series, as we wrap it up today, that God would again remind you of where he wants to collide with you. I want to pray with you about that. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for these stories that inspire us. They remind us of how important it is for us that we collide with you, not just once a long time ago, but on a regular basis, that we are being changed by you. And so help us today to find the hope that you bring, the metamorphosis, the reaction. And God, may we be forever altered and marked so that we can please you, glorify you, and change this world for you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So great to be with you today. I hope you grab your Generate guide. We're going to start using it tomorrow. I will see you next week.